What was the year you left in?
1944.
And it was in August?
In August 1944.
What was the country like before you left?
It was under German occupation.
How did you get to where you could get on the boat?
Tallinn? Okay. We lived not very far from Pärnu, but I don't know if you want to put that down or not. Tallinn is our capital city, and that's where we left from. It has a harbor there, and we left on the ship. And the name of it was Uhto, U-H-T-O, Uhto. Was the name of the ship. Now this is sort of starting in the middle. Okay.
Okay. We can just back up if we need to.
Okay. Let me see. I have some things written down, starting how we got ready to leave and all that stuff.
Okay.
If you want that, I don't know if you want.
Yeah, that'll be good.
Okay. Leaving home. It was summer 1944. Our country had been occupied by the Germans for about 2 years. I don't know how fast it's going. We began to hear heavy artillery shots from very far away, and each day they began to come closer and closer, and the sound became louder and louder. And my grammar is terrible. You have to correct it. The Russians were coming back to occupy our country again. There was a war going on between the Germans and the Russians, and the Germans were being forced out by the Russians from our country. I had just turned 13 in May of that year. When the schools closed for the summer, all the children 12 years and older had to get a summer job.
Now, was that always the case?
Under the Germans. Okay. The parents were allowed to find for their children jobs near their home. If they could not find a job near home, then the Germans would send the children away from home to work for the entire summer. I was lucky. There was a farm nearby, and they needed someone to watch their cows and sheep while they were grazing in the pastures. There were no fences, but they had 2 well-trained sheepdogs who in turn needed to be supervised also. So I spent that summer on the farm taking care of the animals. The weather was beautiful most of the time, but every 15 to 30 minutes there were those loud and finally very loud heavy artillery shots, which were very scary. Oh, I don't know how much you want.
Keep going. This is great.
Okay. I was the oldest of 4 children. Our parents had explained to us of the possibility of having to leave our country instead of having to live under communism. So one evening, my little brother, who was 6 years old at the time, came to the farm to tell me to come home. When we arrived home, Mother was rushing around and packing suitcases. Mother had worked, of course you can put that in or not, Mother had worked all summer cleaning, canning, and so on. So everything in the house looked beautiful, and there was plenty of food there. She handed me a smaller suitcase and asked me to pack my things, but no more than I could carry, and only the most necessary things like clothes, shoes, toothbrush. My grandfather had given me a set of books, a dozen or so, that were written by one of our relatives. His name was Andres Saal, A-N-D-R-E-S, and the last name is S-A-A-L. They were historical novels for young people. I had read about half of those and loved them very much. I asked Mother to please let me bring the rest of those books with me, but she said no. Then I said, just one, please. But the answer again was no, because, I don't know, somewhere Mother explained that we can only take what we are able to carry. We may have to walk long distances somewhere, and then we may have to leave everything behind again. My father was director of the one and only forestry school in Estonia. We had lived, and the name of the place is Tihemetsas, Tihemetsa, almost 2 years. Before that, let's see, since 1940, okay. Before that, the Russians had occupied our country about 2 years, and the man who had the job before my father had been deported to Siberia with his family. So actually, father didn't want to take that job, but he had to. Okay, the building of the forestry school was white, 3-story building with 2 golden lions on each side of the steps at the main entrance. And I showed you the picture there. Yes, but inside there's a bigger picture.
So your father was head of this school?
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
We had a large apartment on the ground floor. Okay, we were to leave our home the next evening to Tallinn by train. And Tallinn is our capital city, and spell it Tallinn. When we got up that morning, the weather was beautiful and sunny. We felt sad, but Mother told us that we will probably never be able to come home again, but let's hope and believe that we will. I decided that morning that I would pay close attention to all the details of that day and remember these things for the rest of my life. When I stepped outside, to my big surprise, the beautiful white building was being painted in camouflage colors by the Germans. So it was green and brown and spotted all over the place. It was horrible looking.
Why?
So when the planes are overhead, they wouldn't see it as well as they would a white building. There was a white stork standing on the roof and looking confused. That stork had had a nest for years on a treetop just a few yards from one end of the building, but no one has ever seen it on the roof before. Okay, these are just little things I noticed. There was a mother hen with half-grown chicks in the backyard, and one very young white rooster trying to show off his crowing. In a large backyard were a number of vegetable gardens, including ours and some of the instructors who worked at the forestry school. I had many pet rabbits, and some with babies. They were running loose in a large building with the cows, horses, and pigs and chickens that belonged to the forestry school. I walked all over the neighborhood trying to give away my rabbits, but sadly nobody wanted them. The answer was always the same. Sorry, we're having a hard time and no food. We can't care for anything else. So I took all of my rabbits and turned them loose and watched them for a little while, munching happily on fresh lettuce and other good things in the garden. Finally, it was time to leave. We put up a few belongings on a horse-driven carriage and rode a few miles to the railway station. Our train was being pulled by a slow steam engine. Our trip to Tallinn took most of the night, and we arrived in Tallinn early in the morning. All of Mother's relatives lived there, or in Tallinn. My mother's mother, who we called Mama M-A-M-M-A, Mother's sister, Valli, V-A-L-L-Y, and her husband, Waldu, W-A-L-D-U, and their 16-year-old son, Leo, L-E-O, lived together in an apartment which they owned. My father, mother, my 2 younger brothers, Hans and George, H-A-N-S, and George, and I, my sister Helvi was born 3 years later. We met at the train station by Uncle Waldo, who picked us up and drove us to their apartment. As we walked in, I noticed 2 suitcases in a hallway near the door.
So is it your whole family?
Yeah, at that time it was our whole family. And this is Mother's side of the family. Father's side of the family lived somewhere else in another city.
So your father's still with you there, right?
Yeah, he was still with us. We greeted my grandmother, Aunt Valli, and Cousin Leo with hugs and kisses. Everybody was quiet.
You don't have to read it if you don't want.
Our ship finally started moving. In front of our ship was a minesweeper, operated by Jewish women. Now you know about the Jews and what happened. Okay. The minesweeper stayed in front of us for 3 hours and then returned to lead another ship on its way. Now that is a very dangerous thing to do because those things would blow up sometimes. The minesweeper, so they put Jewish women to do that.
They put Jewish women because
They didn't care about it.
to them.
They didn't care about it. They didn't want to risk their own lives, so they put them there. We were on a ship for 3 days, and we were not allowed to talk to the Germans or ask them any questions. When we were taken to Germany on the German ship, the weather was chilly, rainy, and foggy. We had to say goodbye. There were also several other ships. Okay. Let me see if I have some more. Our accommodations consisted of a small space on the got that. Did I have it on there from time to time? We heard the Russian planes overhead. That was in there?
I think so. How long did you have to live in Germany?
We lived there 5 years. I'll start reading this, and you tell me if when we get to the point that you don't have it.
Okay.
To lead another ship on its way. We were very sure that the Germans were not concerned about our lives. They were concerned about their crew and their ships. Our accommodations consisted, you probably had that already, of a small space on the floor. Okay, pillow sheets. I went to the top level of the ship from time to time and looked down into the sea. The weather continued to be rainy and foggy, which made the sea look almost black. I knew that we were in mine-infested waters and that we could be blown up any moment. From time to time, we heard the Russian planes overhead and were thankful for the bad weather. We could hear them, but we couldn't see them. The motors of Russian planes had a distinctive sound. They sounded somewhat like mosquitoes. I think they were called Bell Air Cobra. After a while, we were getting hungry. We had skipped lunch, and for supper, we ate some sandwiches we had brought along. The trip to Germany took over 3 days, and we continued to eat whatever we had brought along.
So they didn't give you anything to eat?
Not yet. Those were the last best meals we had for years to come. When we arrived in Germany, the sun was shining. We were told to get off the ship and wait for our suitcases. Each one of us had only a small suitcase with bare necessities. We stood outside near the ship and watched the crane with a net full of suitcases move slowly toward the people. The net had several big holes in it, and several times while the crane moved from the ship across the water, several suitcases plunged into the water. The crowd gasped. We were lucky. Many people lost even what little belongings they were able to bring out of Estonia. A note here at the bottom is, when this ship named Uhto returned to Estonia to bring another load of women and children to Germany, it ran into a mine and the ship went down. Okay, once the baggage had been taken care of, we were herded to a train station. We were ordered to get on a long train. Soon the train started to move, and we had no idea where we were being taken or what would become of us. So we were put on the train, and that was a long train ride. We were on the train probably all day and all night. There was still no food and nothing to drink. So the next day, the train stopped, and we were surrounded by woods. There was no station, and we were ordered off the train. We were ordered to go into the woods, and the soldiers were behind us with rifles, and I don't know how you spell bayonet. They were pointing toward us while we had to walk into the woods. So we were all very scared because we didn't know what they were going to do to us. So people were whispering to each other, and everybody was very worried. But then after a while, we saw some buildings ahead of us. They were barracks, and when we saw that, then we were relieved because we knew they were going to put us up somewhere. The buildings had huge rooms, and they had like triple-decker bunk beds. So there were, I don't know how many. There could have been 100 women and children in just one long barrack, and so we went to bed, but those bunk beds were so bad that they kept falling through. And we could never decide whether you wanted to be in the bottom bunk or the top bunk. And nobody wanted to be in the middle either. So every little bit, one of them came crashing down. So finally, all of a sudden, a young woman started screaming. She was screaming. She said, "Bed bugs, bed bugs, bed bugs," and the whole place, absolutely, everybody panicked, and everybody was crying and screaming and all that. And I suddenly realized that I felt like something was crawling on me too. And there was lots of typhoid fever during the war, and you get those from bed bugs a lot of times. So the next morning, a group of women decided to go and talk to the soldiers and asked if we could sleep outside and not in those barracks. There was sand around those buildings, and they said no, there was no way. The women kept insisting, and finally they came and they sprayed the whole building. It was so strong smelling stuff. It was horrible. Well, we lived through it, but the bed bugs didn't. So, and the years later, our suitcases still smelled. Even when we came to the United States, it still smelled like that spray 5 years later. So that was the first couple days. We stayed there maybe about 3 or 4 days. Then we were put back on the train again. Oh, by the way, the food. We did get something to eat there. In the morning we had black coffee. It wasn't real coffee. It was made out of grain. And there was no milk or no sugar or anything. And a small piece of rye bread, and it had a little bit of jelly on it. So that was breakfast. For lunch, we had cabbage soup, which was water, cabbage, and salt. That was it. And for the evening meal, that same thing. And we always had to stand in a long line to go where we had to go where we could eat. So one day, they had Russian prisoners watching us. And they were carrying rifles, but I'm sure they didn't have any ammunition in it. And we were supposed to stand in a straight line, and I guess I was off a little bit, out of the line a little bit, and he took the barrel of the gun and hit me with my shoulder. My mother was a tiny little person, and she had a temper, and she could speak Russian. And boy, she was telling that Russian soldier off. We didn't know what she was telling. She was talking in Russian, and grandmother kept saying, "Gina, stop it, don't. Because she was scared something bad is going to happen to mother. And but mother didn't pay any attention to anybody. She was furious. And she kept on telling, and that big rush that he was big, and he was just looking at mother like, what's going on here? He just stood there, didn't say anything. So, boy, mother was mad. And, yeah, so by next day, we were back on the train again. And we stayed, and stayed, and stayed. I had a feeling like they were taking us all around in Germany and didn't know what to do with us. Because they had began to lose the war. They were not doing very well, and I guess they didn't know what to do with us. They just had us on the train. So we were on the train at least 2 more days, and then they stopped, and again in the woods, and again they got us off the train, and again we were scared, but we walked to the Southern Barracks again. Again. And the same cabbage soup, always the cabbage soup. And we were so hungry, so my mother and my aunt got permission to leave the camp in the run, see if they could find some food. Of course, they let them go because the children had stayed behind with their mother, but they knew that they'll be back. And so by the end of the day, they came back with one tiny little cabbage head, another one just a little bit bigger, and that's all they got. The Germans wouldn't turn loose of any food. Well, I was so hungry, I started eating that cabbage leaf by leaf, and it was strong. It was like peppery kind of cabbage. My mouth was burning. I ate as long as I could stand it. Then I couldn't eat anymore, and then that night we had some more cabbage soup. And then again, after a few days, the restrooms. There were no restrooms. We had to stand in the hot sun in a long, long line, 2 to 3 hours to get to use the bathroom. And all it was a long ditch that they had dug. So, and when I got through, Mother asked me if I could please go back to the line and stand in line for grandmother. She wasn't able to stand in the line. Well, by the time I got through to the front, I was ready to use the bathroom again, but I had to let grandmother use it. How weird it is. So the bathroom situation was always bad. Everywhere we went was bad. And then we got back on the train again. And it seemed like we waited 2 or 3 days and we were not allowed to ask where we're going or how long we're going to be on the train. We were not allowed to ask any questions. So we just, and those were wooden benches we sat on the whole time. There was no way to lie down. And I remember one night I was looking out the window and it was dark outside and I was so tired and I thought, I want to go home. And that's when it really hit me. It was okay to go home. Anyways, then finally they decided that anybody who would have any relatives or somebody they know that they could leave the camp. And the rest of them, I don't know what became of those people. But my aunt had known a lady in Germany that wasn't very far from there. And she said, yes, we have a relative here. So they went to talk to her, and she took my mother and my aunt to a small German village to see if we could go and live there for a while. And they found a little apartment, and then they came back to the camp, and they told them, yes, we have relatives, and they let us leave. And so we ended up in that village for 1 year. That was a very backward place. The people were uneducated. They were mostly farmers, and they had cows. Cows lived on the ground floor, and the people lived right above it. So you could always smell the cows. They had Polish prisoners of war doing the farm work, while the men, the Germans, were fighting in the war. So those Polish prisoners had it pretty good. They didn't have to fight, and they could live there, you know. Okay, I could stop here with this one. I have another story I'm going to tell you. Mm-hmm. But if you ever wanted it, I could continue on that one. Yeah. But this one is named Annie, 1943. The Germans were occupying our country. Now this summary is repeating itself. This is a separate story. My father was director of a forestry school at the place called Tihemetsa, Tihemetsa. We had 300 forestry students living on the school campus. The main school building was a large, white, 3-story building. The students occupied one wing, and the instructors and my family another wing. Our apartment was on the ground floor. One day, the Germans showed up without a warning and drafted all of the students into the German military to fight the Russians. The young men did not have a chance to call home or notify their families. They simply disappeared. And now the students were replaced by German soldiers. So the whole building was occupied by the Germans. Father still had a job of being responsible for the school and the large fields and the forest that belonged to the school. The instructors, well, they had lost their students, but they continued to live there for a time being. I had a friend named Annie. She was 15 and I was 12. Annie had blondish hair, not completely blonde, sort of in between. She was medium build, a very nice, friendly girl. Annie and her parents lived in a city named Pärnu, P-A-R-N-U, which was several hours by train away from us. Her aunt and uncle lived upstairs on the 2nd floor above our apartment. When the schools were out in the spring, Annie always came to spend the summer with her aunt and uncle. Since there were no other girls living near us, Annie and I became good friends, and I always looked forward to her coming to spend the summer at Tihemetsa. But this summer, I did not see Annie very much. When I went upstairs to see her and asked her to come outside, she always said that she had to stay inside. She didn't give me any reason or any explanation. Yet once in a while, she did come outside just for a little while, and then she disappeared upstairs again. I didn't understand it then, but when I was a little older and had left Estonia, it suddenly occurred to me why Annie stayed indoors so much that summer. You see, Annie was a Jew, and the whole building was full of German soldiers. Along with the soldiers, there was an army officer. He was tall, always in full uniform with a hat on. He was a very arrogant person, and he was all over the place. I did not like him, nor did the rest of the Estonians who saw him. We always tried to stay out of his way. Besides being in charge of his soldiers, he was also in charge of the Russian prisoners of war. They were kept in nearby buildings. When we saw them once in a while, they looked terrible. They were very skinny, with big bellies or pot bellies, whatever you want to put it. They were going through dumpsters and trash cans looking for something to eat. When I saw them, I felt sorry for them, but then someone would remind me that these people had murdered thousands of innocent people and also burned their homes. I should not feel sorry for them. It was a very confusing feeling for me. The German officer had told some of the people in the area that if they needed somebody to help to do some work around the house, they can ask for a Russian prisoner, but they could not pay them nor feed them. One day, Annie and I noticed out of our windows a Russian prisoner working in a nearby woodshed, chopping wood. He had worked all afternoon. I had gone outside, close to the shed, when Annie appeared. I looked back toward the school building a few yards away and saw that the German officer standing on the third floor behind a full-length hall window, watching us. Then Annie said, "I'm going to make the prisoner a ham sandwich with lots of ham and butter on it." "Annie, please don't. The officer is watching us," I said. Annie glanced back toward the hall window and said, "I don't care. That man has worked a long time, and I will make him that sandwich." Again, "Annie, please don't." But she had already vanished into the building. I stepped around the corner so the officer could not see me. In a few minutes, Annie was back with a rye bread, butter, and ham sandwich. I glanced back toward that tall window and saw the officer still standing there. Annie walked quickly toward the prisoner and handed him the sandwich, which was wrapped in a brown paper. I glanced back again toward the window, and the officer was gone. "Hurry, Annie, he's coming." We ran into the building, and as we looked out of the window, we saw the German officer grab the sandwich from the prisoner, and he beat the prisoner. Annie hurried to her apartment, and I to mine. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on our door. I knew instinctively who it was. I was home alone, and I was scared. There was another knock, only louder than the one before. So I slowly opened the door, and there stood the red-faced German officer with the sandwich in his hand. "I want to see your father," he demanded. "He's not here," I answered. "Where is he?" he shouted. "He has gone to the hospital in Pärnu to see my mother." "When will he be back?" "Tomorrow night, I think," I answered. "Who is in charge when he is away?" "Mr. Puide," I answered. Puide. "Where is Mr. Puide?" "His office is next to my father's," I said. With that, he turned around and stormed away. I felt sick and shaky. I locked the door and decided to pretend not to be at home in case he came back. Next evening, when Father returned home, he went to his office for a little while. When he came back, he asked me what had happened the day before. Father smiled a little and told me that the officer had seen Mr. Puide. He had been furious. He had opened up the sandwich and showed it to Mr. Puide. "Look how much butter is on this sandwich," he shouted. "This is sabotage." Mr. Puide quietly explained that this is nothing. You should have seen how much more butter we used before the war started. Annie and I talked about this incident sometime later and felt for certain that the German officer ate up the sandwich himself. I don't know whatever became of Annie. She did not come back to Tihemet the following summer in 1944, and that was the summer we left Estonia. 1940, and I was 9 years old. Estonia became occupied by the Red Army, which is the Russians, on June 17, 1940. For about a year leading up to this event, the Estonian people had been very worried and afraid that the Russians may be soon coming to take possession of our country. Our parents had not told us children much about their fears since they did not want to scare us, but we noticed early on that people were behaving differently. There were small groups of people standing around, and we, the children, overheard many worrisome conversations. There were also many meetings going on, and our parents attended some of them. Since my father was a forester, we always lived in the country. We had already moved 3 times since I was born. We now live in Summerpalu, S-O, which is O with a line across top, which you can't do there, Merpalu, Summerpalu. Our most favorite place in all Estonia. The house we lived in was long brick house, and Father's office was on one end, and then came the part where we lived, and then a hallway and stairway leading to an upstairs apartment. Then the downstairs continued to a stable where our horse, 2 cows, and chickens lived. And on the far end lived a married couple who took care of the animals and some farmland we had. Summerpalu was a beautiful place, very near a lake where we swam all summer long. Our main road was close and went right past our house. When the Russians came to Estonia, their troops marched right past our house. They started in the morning and marched till late in the evening, day after day for several weeks. All the people who lived in our area were frightened. My cousin Leo, L-E-O, who was 12 and spent the summer with us, my 2 younger brothers, Hans and George, and I, along with 2 other neighbors' children, took it upon ourselves to protect our homes. We went out every morning after breakfast, now that was in the summer, and stood by the side of the road, smiling and waving at the Russian soldiers. We thought that if we were nice to them, then maybe they would not kill us or burn down our houses. We were even afraid to leave our post long enough to go home for lunch. Our parents were not sure whether this was a good or bad idea, but they reluctantly allowed us to do that. As we stood next to that dusty dirt road, and we observed closely these soldiers and were ready to run if they started coming toward us, we also noticed their pathetic-looking uniforms. They were wearing long green army wool coats in the middle of the summer. Their uniforms had holes in them, and many were not even wearing boots. They had wrapped their feet in rags. They looked tired and were dragging their feet, and I will never forget that peculiar sweet-smelling tobacco odor that came from their cigarettes. Summer 1941, and I was 10. By this time things had drastically changed. Those poor tired-looking Russian soldiers had become real monsters. Instead of standing by that dusty road watching the soldiers, we, the children and adults, ran into the hiding when we saw them coming from far away. Woods were very near to our house, and all the neighborhood children lived in the woods most of that summer. The adults had to work, but they too headed for the woods when the soldiers were coming. Also, everybody spent the night in the woods. The mosquitoes were terrible. One day the soldiers stopped by our house and took our horse, Father's green motorcycle that was his only mode of transportation, also Father's hunting rifle. Wild game was about the only meat we had then, so there went our meat. The Russians came back again on horseback another day and came into our house and followed Mother from room to room with a bayonet pointed at her back. At the same time, 2 soldiers had gone into Father's office and ordered Father and 2 other men who worked for him to stand against the wall. Do you want me to say the bad stuff?
True. I mean, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. I don't know if you. I don't want it to bother you. I know it might. Anyway, they pointed the rifles at them when suddenly there was some kind of commotion outside. One soldier came running into the office from outside and said something excitedly in Russian language. All of the soldiers ran outside, jumped on their horses, and left in a big hurry. Thank you, Lord. Yep, this is all I have about the Russians written. Of course, there's a lot more to come, but I can tell you whatever else you want to know.
Okay.
That was 1939, and I was 8 years old. About a month before the school started, before the new school year started, okay. I was visiting our relatives in Thailand, and that was Mother's sister, Vali, her husband, Uncle Waldo, their son Leo, and grandmother, Mama. And I went to school there that year in Thailand, so I stayed with them. One afternoon, Aunt Vali took me shopping for some school clothes. I had also wished for a red sweater and asked Aunt Vali if she would buy me one. My aunt was about medium height with brown hair and brown eyes. She was always cheerful, laughed, and talked a lot. But on this day, she seemed more quiet and serious. She was a good, generous person, always eager to please. When we entered the first clothing store, I reminded her again about that red sweater. So Aunt Polly took me to a long counter for the sweaters were. Right away, I saw several red sweaters and pulled her by the hand through the sweaters. But for some reason, she stopped and looked at some blue ones. She showed me a blue sweater that would really look pretty on me, but my attention was focused on the red ones. Then she showed me some green, brown, and some other colors, but she ignored all the red sweaters. Finally, we left that store and visited a couple more. But the same thing happened over and over again. And finally ignored all the red sweaters and tried to talk me into trying on any of the other colors except the red ones. I was so confused and could not understand why I couldn't have the red one, the red color that I so wanted. Finally, poor Aunt Vali, she saw a pretty sweater with all the rainbow colors in it. It had a narrow horizontal stripes from top to bottom. Horizontal is from, I said top to bottom, I'm wrong.
That's right.
And if you looked hard enough, you could see once in a while a tiny red stripe among the rainbow colors. She showed that very small red stripe, and even though it was a pretty sweater and Aunt Vali bought it, I was not happy with it. When I went back home on the train later that year and told Mother about Aunt Vali's strange behavior that day, Mother explained to me that only communist supporters would wear red and the rest of us would not. I really felt bad about having given my aunt such a hard time on that shopping trip. After that, I never wanted to wear red again. Then years later, when we came to the United States, and 6 months later, on our first Christmas here, I received a Christmas present from a very nice American lady. When I opened it up, you may have guessed it. It was the brightest red sweater I had ever seen. I was staring at it and trying to smile at the same time. But it was very difficult. A lot had happened since I was 8. We had lived under communism and Nazism, escaped from Estonia, and endured the post-war years. I thanked that lady and told her that I liked the red sweater, but really I could not stand to look at it. I wore it twice in her presence and sometime later gave it away. It has been 57 years since then. It's been longer now. And I started wearing red once in a while, about 10 years ago. Still, I'm not very comfortable doing so. That's the red sweater. And Father, back the radios were bigger. They had huge batteries, and almost like a car battery, not quite, maybe pretty big. And the Father hid his into our doghouse. and then covered it up with straw, and he would go and listen to it late at night. And he got the news from Sweden, I think. Yeah, Swedish news. So because we didn't know what was going on with the war, who was wherever, when the Germans are coming or when the Russians are coming, or didn't know how far away they were because we couldn't get any news. And the newspapers were pure propaganda. You couldn't believe anything right there. So Father would go late at night and listen to the news on the radio, like it came from Sweden, but it spoke in, I forgot, in German or Estonian anyway. Father could understand, so we could have some idea what's going on.
What about when Moscow said that the USSR had to establish military bases in Estonia? Were you there when that happened?
What year was that? That was probably 39 or
39, 40.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard about they were just going to do that, and that's all. They were not going to occupy a country, and that's what they said.
But then they occupied
They
the country.
They just lied. Yeah, they came right in and took it. And so, see, we had from 1940, 39, 40s when it all started. And see, it just ended in 1991 or 2 when the Russians left Estonia.
Yeah.
But it's full of Russians now. There's a lot of them just didn't want to leave, and they're living there.
It started in 1940, didn't it?
Yeah. All the promises, and then, gosh, that's a long time. It's 50 years.
Hey, there's that guy.
Oh yeah, Konstantin Patz is his name. I need to write that out too sometime. The life in the German village, because that was sort of it. Okay, and those people. Okay, there were no men. The boys. Let me see. I think 16 and older were in war, and then the people over 65 were also in that village. The men. The rest of them were in us. Fighting the war, and it was a very backward place. We were amazed because Germany usually was a very progressive country and all, but those villages they didn't know much what's going on. And we had been there. We had been there about 3 months in that village. And we hadn't heard from Father. We didn't know if he was going to get out or what happened to him. A lot of them didn't. A lot of men didn't get out. And but Mother kept having feeling he got out. He's getting out. He's coming. He's coming. He's coming. And finally, her husband was also, and her son, missing. And she was afraid she'd never see him again. And so one day we went out for a walk outside the village, and we were ready to turn around and come back. And then Mother said, "Let's go a little bit more. I want to go around that corner." And when we did, there was Father coming, pushing his bicycle. That was great. And he was able to bring his bike, and he had a huge metal can, I'd say about this high. They used to put milk in it. He had pork, just like fatback kind of pork in there. He had packed it in salt water. He knew that we were starving, and that would probably keep us going. And he did. He left it somewhere, and he had to go back later and get it. And that pork, it did save our lives, because there was no fat of any kind, no cooking oil, no nothing. So grandmother did the cooking, and she would fry that fat back, and then she would fry something else in it, which we had very little food. But that stuff began to turn rancid, and we smelled stuff rancid. And as time went by, it got worse and worse. It won't kill you, it won't even make you sick. It just smells horrible. But we had to keep eating it. And I remember coming home from school, I could smell it down the road. Rancid. Grandmother was frying. But it did. We used up every bit of it. Made it last as long as it could. And so Father, all he had was his forestry uniform, which was green. And he had some stars here. And when the Germans saw him, they thought he was a soldier from another country, and he got arrested one time. He had to do a lot of explaining, and that's the only clothing he had. and that he was in forestry, he was not in some kind of a service. It was not. They thought maybe he was British, or maybe he was American or somebody. And so he had a lot of explaining. I don't know how he talked his way out of it finally. And so after a year, okay, the war ended. Was it in May? It's when Americans occupied that village, a lot of the other parts of Germany. And first, they camped out outside the village for about a week. And every once in a while, there was a loud shot coming from there, like a heavy artillery shot. And they didn't know if there were any German soldiers in that village or not. So they didn't come in right away, the Americans. And we didn't know who was coming. And could have been the Russians, could have been Americans. There again, we had no mail, we had no newspaper, we had no news. So we were worried. And then little George was roaming around somewhere in the fields and found one of the flyers the Americans had dropped. And you weren't supposed to pick those up either. But he did. He stuffed it in his pocket. I remember it was all crumpled up. He came and showed us. And they showed that the Americans are coming and not to be afraid and all this and that. And that they're not going to hurt us. And so that's how we found out then that the Americans were coming. But still to the last minute we weren't 100% sure, you know. And I remember they came in late in the evening. They were driving tanks and jeeps, and they went through the village with people lined up the streets. Everybody was very quiet. Nobody was sure what might happen and all. And we kept thinking it's Americans, but they had the white star on their jeeps and vehicles. That confused us because Russians had the red star, but they had the star not. We didn't know Americans had a star on theirs. So we went every once in a while, but we worried a little bit. But finally we figured out it was the Americans, and that was good. But the Germans didn't like it one bit, but we did. So of course we had to keep quiet. We didn't want them to get mad at us since we were still living there. And another thing was we had bombing raids during the war. I've told you about that. Okay, the sirens would go off during the night, during the day, and we had to go in the cellar under the houses when that happened. And sometimes we had 3-4 bombing raids during the night, and we could not sleep. And we couldn't sleep, so we had to get up and go down the cellar. And when it was over, finally, go back upstairs and go to bed. And then another one would come, and it was back again. So we were worn out by day because we didn't sleep much. And finally, we got to that point that we didn't want to get up. Mother would run around in circles trying to get us out of bed. We wouldn't get up. We hear the bombs falling, and we would not get up. We were so tired. And then one night, Mother really got upset, and she said she couldn't do it anymore. She's by herself, having to look after us, and we don't cooperate. And she just can't do it. She was crying, and then finally got up and decided to behave ourselves after that. But I heard one of the soldiers was telling that one time on television that they had come to that point too. They wouldn't get up when they heard the bombs falling and trying to get to safety. They just kept on trying to sleep.